Well, good afternoon to everybody, and thank you to those brave souls who have gone against the siesta time to join us in this drab day of November. My name is Daniel de Torres. I'm the director of the Small Arms Survey, and it's a great pleasure to be part and to open this event on gendering small arms control for peace, the perspective from North Africa and the Sahel. I think it's a wonderful opportunity for us to hear from three different speakers, one via video, the other two here in the flesh, how exactly this works in the field, the different challenges that they have, but particularly what is the role of women, particularly women in communities, in making effective the control of small arms, particularly legal small arms, and to talk a little bit about the gender component of the small arms control. As you know, and looking at the crowd, you're probably all familiar with the concept. Gender is not about women, it's about men and women, it's about who they are, it's about the social and cultural expectations. And as you know, many cultures, the possession of a gun is an equivalent with masculinity. It's very often a rite of passage for young boys to become men would be to own their first firearm. So there's a lot of gender factors that interact with official and unofficial initiatives for small arms control. So we'll get to learn much more about the topic with our speakers. I would like to thank and acknowledge the work of my colleagues, Mia Shoev and Ala Tartir, who have organized everything. Will be moderating and participating in this event. And very, very warm thank you also to the governments of the Netherlands and the government of Canada, who have not only supported this event, but in the case of the Netherlands, have been supporting since 2012 our security assessment in North Africa project, from which a lot of this knowledge comes. And the same, Canada is offering great support for our GLASS project, Gender Lens for Arms Control Support and Sustainability. So I hope we have a very good discussion. There will be interventions by the speakers, and then you'll have the chance to participate in a little back and forth discussion with them. Given the size of the crowd, I think there'll be plenty of room for everybody to ask questions and bring new ideas. With that, I would like to invite His Excellency, the Ambassador Robert Gabrielse, from the Disarmament Ambassador from the Netherlands, to say a few words on behalf of his government. Thank you, Ambassador.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Daniel, for your introduction. And also thank you and your organization, Small Arms Survey, and your colleagues for organizing this together with others. Well, I just make a few general remarks, and then it's up to the experts to take this further. Well, in general, women play a crucial role when it comes to controlling small arms and light weapons, and therefore we think it's important that you all are here and together to discuss it. Illicit trafficking of small arms and light weapons has taken a heavy toll on human lives, and especially women and children, accounting most of the casualties. Illicit trafficking of small arms and light weapons does not cause the conflict in which the arms and weapons are used. However, it affects the intensity and the duration of the violence and encourages militancy rather than a peaceful resolution of unsettled differences. And maybe even worse is that we see a downward spiral in which insecurity leads to a higher demand for weapons, which in turn leads to greater insecurity. The Netherlands therefore believes that it is important that small arms and light weapons are controlled properly, not only in North Africa and the Sahara region, but all over the world. That is why we've been very supportive of the SIS research project called Security Assessment in North Africa, SANA, since it started, as you already mentioned, since 2012. But we also contribute to other projects on small arms and light weapons, for instance, in Southeast Europe. Transparency is an important element because it's a sine qua non for an informed and fact-based discussion on arms exports and their regulations. Every month, the Netherlands publishes an overview of all granted export and transit licenses for military goods, as well as for dual goods. This overview contains for each license a description of the goods, the country of destination, the value in euros, and other characteristics. And the Netherlands has been publishing these overviews since 2004. So we believe maximum transparency in our case. Therefore, we're also proud that the Netherlands is now the number 2 in the Small Arms Trade Transparency Barometer. And we think it will be very hard to beat Switzerland, the number 1 since 2009, but we will do our utmost. The Netherlands aspires to a level playing field within the EU and actively contributes to exchange of information with other EU member states. We do so on the basis of the EU Common Position on Arms Export Controls, which sets out 8 criteria by which each EU member state must judge potential export licenses. And one of the criteria is respect for human rights and international human law in the destination country. Although the Common Position is legally binding, there is no formal EU mechanism to enforce it. Arms export controls is a matter of national sovereignty. Arms policy is implemented and enforced at the national level. Well, thank you very much. I hope you have a great afternoon here. I will stay here, and I'm also curious what the experts will say. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I will be brief as well, since we all look forward to hearing the panelists. On behalf of the Permanent Mission of Canada, thank you for joining us for this event. Thank you to the Small Arms Survey for organizing this discussion, and to the panelists for accepting to participate in this exchange. Just a few words to say that Canada is particularly pleased to support this event through the funding of the Small Arms Survey GLASS project. And though Daniel already said it, I will repeat, the GLASS project means Gender Lens for Arms Control Support and Sustainability. Among other things, the GLASS project seeks gender-responsive and evidence-based solutions to address the negative impacts of the proliferation of small arms and light weapons. The project also aims to contribute to increasing women's participation in multilateral policymaking forums and to effectively integrate gender perspectives in arms control policy and practice. In this sense, it complements other initiatives that Canada is supporting in the area of disarmament and arms control, including mine action initiatives, for instance. Also, as many of you know, Canada is committed to the implementation of the WPS, Women, Peace and Security Agenda, and to gender equality. We see this as essential to advancing human rights and as the most effective way to achieve peace, security, and sustainable development. But why precisely the GLASS project is important to Canada? Between the policy and legal framework of arms control and WPS, and I'm referring, for instance, to United Nations Security Council resolutions, to international legal instruments, between this framework and gender-responsive and evidence-based policymaking and programming, there appears to be a certain gap, and thus room for connecting these two elements. We believe this project contributes significantly to this purpose, and thus to the achievement of the converging objectives of the arms control and WPS agenda. Now, I should also add that this is in line with a long-standing administrative drive from the Government of Canada towards evidence-based and decision-making policy and an effort to shape policy in terms of results. Having said this, we realize that questions remain about how arms control and the WPS agenda interconnect. I have to say that even among colleagues in our own foreign ministry, it has been the case. I trust that this event, hopefully with other discussions this week, will help clarify this question, and I hope that we can all take away some valuable lessons to share, taken from the example of women involved in arms control in North Africa and the Sahel region. I believe we have a great panel today to discuss these issues, so I will stop here, and I look forward to hearing others' insights and views. Thank you.
Thank you very much. May I invite the co-panelists to join us, please? Good afternoon once again. My name is Ala Tartir, and I'm a researcher at the Small Arms Survey and coordinator of the Small Arms Survey project, Security Assessment in North Africa. And thank you very much for all of you for being here today. It's really great to see all this interest. And thank you very much for the opening remarks and notes. And it's really a pleasure to be moderating this event today. And be in the company of inspiring speakers, whom I thank very much for being with us today to bring your different insights and expertise from different parts of the world to focus on gendering small arms control for peace using the experiences of North Africa and Sahel-Sahara region. The great insights that we will have into controlling arms, building peace, but also imagining a different future based on all the work that you've been doing through a local society level, ministerial level, governmental level, and also continental level. So I'll try to be brief, just to go through the organization of the event. We'll have 3 interventions. The first intervention will be by Inas Mohammed, who unfortunately could not be with us for administrative reasons, but luckily technology helped us. Let's hope it is the case. Inas recorded a 10 minutes intervention to take us through her experience as a senior policy officer for disarmament affairs at the African Union's Peace and Security Department. Currently, she's on sabbatical leave, and she is a researcher at UNIDER. So we have 10 minutes recording here. We'll play it after I finish my remarks. And following that, we will have Colonel Major Nama Sagara on my left, and Colonel Nama works at the Permanent Secretariat to counter the proliferation of small arms and light weapons in Mali. So a very warm welcome, and thank you again for being with us here. And Colonel Major will deliver her notes in French, and this is where my colleague Maya Shop will recap some of the main points that you will be discussing. And Maya is associate researcher and the coordinator of the Gender Lens for Arms Control Support and Sustainability GLASS project. And finally, last but not least, we'll have Hajar Sharif with us. Hajar is the co-founder of Together We Built It organization from Tripoli, Libya. And we look forward to hear your insights, and thank you again for accepting the invitation to be here. And finally, Mia will come back to the stage and tell us more as a discussant, some main takeaways and points on the discussion, and I hope we will have enough time for some Q&A for around half an hour. So that is the logistical structure. I'm the moderator, so that was my duty to do. And one final note, please do join our mailing list. Please follow us on social media because we organize many interesting events, but we also publish many good research projects. So please visit our website and join that. So with no further ado, I would like to give the floor to Inas Mohammed, who recorded this clip for 10 minutes. And I think it is working.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. In case I haven't already been introduced by Dr. Ala, my name is Ines Mohammed, and I'm the Senior Policy Officer for Disarmament Affairs at the African Union Peace and Security Department. I am currently on sabbatical from the African Union, and for the next 12 months, I will be serving as a researcher at the Conventional Arms Program of the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, based in Geneva. I deeply regret not being able to join you in person due to some administrative obstacles, but I am grateful to Dr. Ala and to the Small Arms Survey for accepting my participation through this pre-recorded message, and to serve alongside Major Colonel Nima Sagara and Ms. Hajar Sharif. I would also like to thank the governments of Canada and the Netherlands for supporting this event. The topic of arms control and gender is indeed a complex and loaded one that cannot be fully discussed in a couple of hours. And so I will limit my intervention to two key aspects. The first is on the knowledge and research gaps when it comes to gender in arms control. And the second will touch on the aspects of women's participation in arms control. I would like to highlight that the points that I will share are derived from broader experiences from the African region, which are also relevant, of course, to the Sahel, the focus of this event. But I trust that my co-panelists will share their in-depth experiences from the Sahel region and from North Africa. On the aspect of knowledge and research gaps, it must be recognized that evidence-based and evidence on gendered impacts of armed violence in Africa remains fairly limited and mostly anecdotal. This is largely due to the scarcity of sex disaggregated data, which is a problem affecting the quality of statistics and evidence-based policy setting on a broad range of issues. However, when it comes to peace and security, there are specific challenges, and those pertain to the lack of institutional capacities in countries experiencing or emerging from conflict, as well as political resistance at times to a comprehensive concept of gender in peace and security. Following from that, African policy organs have typically focused on the direct impact of armed violence on women and girls, particularly in terms of victimization, without adequate focus on the role of women in arms proliferation and in arms control, as well as the impact of armed violence on other gender categories. I wish to recall that earlier this year, the African Union and the Small Arms Survey produced a joint study that assesses the extent and nature of illicit small arms proliferation across the continent. The study aims to inform evidence-based small arms control policies and targeted response measures. While the gendered impact of arms flows was beyond the scope of the study, it nonetheless highlighted current knowledge gaps based on anecdotal evidence reported by African states, as well as regional and international organizations that have contributed information and data to the study. These anecdotes include, for example, the involvement of women in countries such as Uganda and the Central African Republic in trafficking weapons and ammunition across borders. The Small Arms Survey Security Assessment in North Africa also highlights similar cases where women took part in concealing and transporting weapons in Libya. These type of examples warrant further research that would improve understanding of the recruitment methods, the roles, and the motivations for women and girls involved in small arms trafficking. The findings may even challenge stereotypes and enable innovative and targeted response measures. Another example that in the Sahel region, acquisition of firearms are known to be linked with concepts of masculinity and social status, which is believed to fuel the artisanal firearms production. Therefore, the one-dimensional interventions that aim to offer socioeconomic alternatives for gunsmiths may not be sufficient to reduce illicit arms proliferation among civilians, and also the non-state armed groups that benefit from this growing industry. A gendered approach that investigates the social perceptions surrounding gun ownership and how women may have a role in co-creating and reinforcing such notions will be essential for a comprehensive response to addressing this phenomenon. I would now like to move to the second aspect on women's participation in arms control. Again, it must be highlighted that at the continental level, women remain underrepresented in decision-making and policy-setting platforms, but also at the national practical level. Generally, there has been notable efforts to increase women's participation in the different areas of peace and security, but particularly in mediation. A notable example here is the establishment by the African Union of the Network of African Women in Conflict Prevention and Mediation, FEMWISE. This network provides a platform for strategic advocacy and capacity building and networking, and it aims to enhance women's participation in peacemaking more broadly across the continent. As this initiative is being implemented, of course, there is a need to assess its transformative impact and to adjust it and improve it accordingly. However, when it comes to issues considered hard security, women remain severely underrepresented at the policy setting platforms, which remain dominated by mid and senior level male military officials. While there has been, of course, encouraging examples of women in senior leadership positions in the security sector, such as ministers of defense and heads of national commissions of small arms, these really constitute the exception. A very encouraging example, of course, is Mali, which has had 2 consecutive female heads of its National Small Arms Commission. It must also be emphasized that the gap in women's participation in arms control across the small arms life cycle cannot be meaningfully and sustainably addressed without taking into account broader economic, social, and policy dimensions to women's participation in the security sector and the required approaches to remove the barriers to their enrollment and advancement in these fields. And here, capitalizing on the synergies and the convergence between the agendas for arms control, the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, and the SDGs is critical to achieving this goal. I would like to note that there has been encouraging developments also at the level of the African Union. Earlier this year, a Continental Results Framework for monitoring and reporting the implementation of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda was adopted. It's a 10-year program that includes 41 indicators in total for measuring national progress in all aspects of Resolution 1325. Some of these indicators are quite relevant to arms control, as they require states to provide disaggregated data on the numbers and percentages of women in decision-making positions in the different security institutions, in the civil service and in the foreign service and in other areas, and also in post-conflict recovery processes, including DDR. So in concluding, I would really like to underline 2 issues. The first is that there is a need to prioritize a comprehensive approach to research on gender and arms control, and which goes beyond assessing the impact of armed violence on limited categories. And such research really needs to be targeting policymakers and should be aimed to inform programmatic interventions. Secondly, of course, there is an urgent need to provide direct assistance to the states themselves so that they can build the required capacities to establish the necessary mechanisms to gradually fulfill their obligations pursuant to the different agendas. Whether it's the 2030 Agenda, Women, Peace and Security, but also the developments within the Small Arms Program of Action. In finishing this intervention, I would like to thank you all once again, and apologies for not being able to be there in person. I would be happy to discuss this topic further with those of you who are interested, and you may reach me on the Geneva Peace Week application.
Thank you very much, Ines. Hopefully it will, this tank, reach Addis Ababa. And as Ines said, you can reach her via the application of the Geneva Peace Week. Inas raised a number of important issues and a number of important points, but also we can continue the conversation now with the Colonel Major to tell us more based on her experience in Mali and to connect some of the other dots that we have. So, podium is yours. Would you like to speak from that?
Okay.
Or here.
No, thank you. Bonjour tout le monde. Le micro marche?
Yeah, it's working.
Bonjour. Je vais m'exprimer en français. Je remercie Armes Surveillées. Comme j'ai dit, j'ai toujours utilisé vos documents. On a travaillé ensemble. Merci de m'avoir invité ici. C'est ma première fois d'être ici. Et je suis ravie d'être avec vous et puis de travailler avec vous. Et je remercie aussi le Canada. On ne m'a pas dit de le dire, mais je le dis. Et pour tout ce qu'ils font pour nous, je le dis, parce que chez nous, je suis de l'Afrique de l'Ouest. Aujourd'hui, on a des problèmes. Tout le monde le sait. Et il y a des gens qui nous aident honnêtement et sincèrement. C'est pourquoi je les remercie. Il y a des pays qui nous aident honnêtement et sincèrement. Ça a un sens. Oui. Donc, je vais parler du contexte du Mali, avant de... Peut-être après, on va faire une discussion, je ne sais pas. L'Afrique de l'Ouest, vous savez, a fait l'objet depuis des décennies de guerre civile, particulièrement au Libéria, en Sierra Leone, au cours des années 2000. Ces différentes guerres furent meurtrières et provoquèrent une crise humanitaire sans précédent dans la sous-région. La République de Guinée et la Côte d'Ivoire ont connu des perturbations et des tensions avant, pendant et après les processus électoraux. Ces dernières années, dans la région du Sahel, le Niger et le Nigeria ont connu une recrudescence d'actes terroristes avec Boko Haram. En plus, à la suite des printemps arabes ayant conduit à la chute du régime de Kadhafi, des éléments armés qui collaboraient avec ces derniers ont massivement quitté les territoires libyens. Ainsi, un nombre important d'entre eux seraient revenus en terre malienne, parce qu'il y avait beaucoup de Maliens qui étaient installés là-bas depuis des dizaines d'années, sans que le gouvernement de l'époque ait pu procéder à leur désarmement. Donc, ils sont venus avec des armes dans le pays. Cela a permis d'exposer le Mali et voir la sous-région aux crises successives, car des mouvements terroristes comme Al-Qaïda, au Maghreb islamique, Hakimi, en Sardine, Moudjaou, et tout récemment d'autres groupes tels que le Front de libération du Massina dans le centre du Mali. Cette situation a fragilisé le Mali depuis la crise de 2012 au plan sécuritaire, avec l'intensification des rébellions, d'actes terroristes et conflits communautaires dans le nord et plus récemment dans le centre du pays. Ces conflits ont entraîné une insécurité résiduelle caractérisée par l'exacerbation de la circulation d'armes illicites et l'existence de mines encore enfouies dans le sous-sol des zones affectées par les dits conflits. Cette prolifération de groupes armés rébellions en Afrique de l'Ouest et dans le Sahel développe de plus en plus l'instabilité des États ainsi que la perturbation de tous les équilibres avec leur corollaire de l'absence de l'autorité de l'État, l'insécurité des personnes et biens, la criminalité transfrontalière organisée et la circulation illicite des armes et les grands trafics. Ces troubles récurrents ont facilité les innombrables attaques dans les régions septentrionales, plaçant au-delà du Mali la sous-région ouest-africaine dans ce cycle de violence et d'insécurité dont elle a encore du mal à sortir. Très souvent, l'on a surtout tendance à médiatiser la situation qui se dégrade de jour en jour dans la région du Nord. Pendant ce temps, pourtant, on note l'avancée des mouvements terroristes vers le centre du pays. De nombreuses attaques commises par le Front islamique, le Front de libération du Massina, FLNM, qui vise une certaine tribalisation du djihadisme vers le sud. Cette situation, plus que complexe, facilite le glissement progressif du front djihadiste vers le sud. Je m'excuse. Incomplexe. Cette situation, plus que complexe, la situation de l'apparition du djihadisme dans le centre est souvent interprétée par les populations elles-mêmes comme le fruit de l'accumulation de frustrations de divers ordres, bien au-delà des motivations d'un djihadisme qui se nourrirait de l'imaginaire et religieux. Aujourd'hui, l'état des lieux dans le domaine de la sécurité au Mali, considéré dans son sens holistique, révèle des lacunes énormes, des dysfonctionnements abyssaux, des déficits considérables qui sont fortement préjudiciables à la vie de la nation. Le pays est en effet surexposé à une foule de risques, menaces, vulnérabilités et fragilités qui impactent considérablement le présent et l'avenir politique, économique, social, culturel et confessionnel du pays. Les conséquences sont désastreuses et les plus grandes victimes de cette situation d'insécurité et d'instabilité sont les groupes vulnérables, notamment les femmes, les jeunes, les enfants et les personnes âgées qui payent le prix fort. Il faudra mettre en exergue que les femmes demeurent une couche certes vulnérable, mais dont le statut de stabilisateur en matière de médiation, de sensibilisation, d'éducation et de résolution des conflits est communément reconnu. Les études menées en matière d'impact sociaux des conflits en Afrique ont pu démontrer que la dimension genre est rarement prise en compte dans les processus de prévention et de résolution des conflits, d'où la nécessité de les y inclure pleinement. Le rôle des femmes dans le contrôle des armes, car au Mali aujourd'hui, nous mettons beaucoup d'accent sur ce rôle qui, pour nous, va nous aider à nous en sortir. Donc, les caractéristiques uniques et profondément sociétales du problème des armes légères nécessitent une intégration complète des perspectives du genre de toutes les dimensions du contrôle des armes légères. Le commerce illicite et la prolifération des ALPC ont un impact différent sur les femmes, les hommes, les filles et les garçons. Le plan d'action national devrait répondre aux besoins de ces groupes dans chacun de ces domaines fonctionnels en accordant une attention particulière aux groupes les plus vulnérables. Les femmes restent sous-représentées dans le processus de contrôle des armes légères et occupent rarement des postes de décision. Assurer leur participation et leur représentation égale et significative est une condition préalable pour apporter une diversité de perspectives et de préoccupations reliées au genre dans les domaines de la sécurité internationale, nationale et locale, menant à des politiques plus inclusives, efficaces et durables. À la 3e conférence d'examen du programme d'action tenue à New York en juin 2018, tous les États ont reconnu l'importance de la question de l'intégration d'une perspective sexe-spécifique et ont décidé de prendre des mesures ciblées dans le cadre de la lutte contre le commerce illicite des armes légères. La REV 3 a abouti à un accord sur un langage progressiste sur les sujets liés au genre. Ceci comprend la reconnaissance des impacts différents dans le concept des politiques et programmes des mesures de contrôle des armes légères, un appel à une participation intégrale et une représentation des femmes dans tous les processus, une demande visant à assurer la coordination entre les autorités nationales responsables de la mise en œuvre du POA et les ministères ou autres autorités nationales responsables des questions relatives aux femmes ou à l'égalité des sexes, ainsi qu'avec les groupes de femmes de la société civile. La collecte des données désagrégées par genre dans les rapports nationaux. Pour la première fois dans le processus du POA, le lien a été établi entre la mise en œuvre du POA et la lutte contre la violence basée sur le genre. La REV 3 encourage les commissions nationales sur les armes légères à inclure dans leurs travaux les fonctionnaires s'occupant des questions du genre. Les femmes devraient animer le processus de la lutte engagée contre la violence armée, la prolifération des armes au sein de la communauté, au sein des communautés sur les territoires nationaux. Leur implication effective dans les activités relatives au contexte de la prolifération des armes légères et des petits calibres garantira un succès au niveau local. Pour accompagner les structures étatiques en charge de la sécurité, les femmes doivent inscrire la sensibilisation des populations par rapport à l'insécurité et la prolifération des armes comme priorité, car sans sécurité, il n'y a pas de développement. Être impliqué dans la formation et la stabilisation, la sensibilisation, démantèlement des réseaux et trafiquants d'armes. Elles doivent renforcer le partenariat entre les structures de l'État en charge et de la sécurité et la société civile. Elles doivent transmettre les informations sur les structures en charge de la sécurité aux populations et identifier leurs préoccupations. Suivre les activités, je finis dans une seconde. Suivre les actions parlementaires sur les questions armes légères et petits calibres. Organiser des journées nationales, ce que nous faisons, d'information sur les APC entre les différents acteurs techniques et politiques. Organiser des caravanes de sensibilisation. Actuellement, à Bamako, nous sommes en train d'organiser, les caravanes vont partout, du sud au nord et de l'ouest à l'ouest, pour sensibiliser toute la population sur les dangers des armes. Parce que les armes légères à Bamako tuent beaucoup. Et ça, c'est des armes de fabrication locale. Mais à l'intérieur du pays, c'est les autres armes légères qui, comme on peut dire, ce que Kofi Annan a dit, c'est les armes à destruction massive. Parce qu'il y a tous les jours au moins un mort par les armes légères au Mali. Donc, organiser des réunions, des séminaires de formation pour les représentants du secteur privé. Nous voulons impliquer toute la population malienne, jeunes, enfants et vieux, dans la lutte contre la prolifération des armes. Et ça, c'est l'objectif des femmes. C'est les femmes qui se mobilisent pour mener ces activités. Et faire la mobilisation sociale et la mobilisation des ressources en faveur de la lutte contre la prolifération des armes légères. Pour ceux qui vont vous attendre en anglais, j'en ai fini. Merci pour votre attention. Oui.
Thank you very much, Colonel Major Sagara. And maybe Mia can recap in 2 minutes the many points that I'm sure Colonel Sagara summarizes.
Thanks. No, that's a challenge. I will do my very best to do justice to your big presentation in 2 minutes. I will skip the conflict resume part for the sake of brevity. I think you all understood how she talked about the conflict that has arisen since 2012 and is now trickling down to the south. She talks about terrorist groups getting more influence towards the south because of the conflict dynamics. She talked about structural violence, long-standing grievances that the population in Mali takes as the explanation for why this is happening and why it's possible for the terrorist groups to advance. And she mainly emphasized that the consequences of the conflict are disproportionately affecting vulnerable groups in society: women, children, youth, the elderly, and pardon me if I forgot somebody on your list. She emphasized that women in Mali are acknowledged as key figures in peacemaking, as mediators. Their roles are well acknowledged. However, in small arms control specifically, their representation, especially on the leadership level, is not yet full and equal, as SDG 5 would call it, or meaningful, as other UN documents would refer to it. She emphasizes that small arms control requires a holistic perspective when it comes to gender that takes into account the differential effects, the differential impacts of small arms and light weapons, their illicit proliferation and use and misuse on women, men, boys, and girls, and let me say people of all genders. She emphasized that national action plans on small arms would need a gender perspective that takes all vulnerable groups into account. And then she focused on women's roles as key actors for assisting governments in, and I have got a list that ranges from peace education, improving or strengthening civil society, state partnerships, parliamentary oversight involving the private sector, unpacking and dismantling trafficking networks because women are key influencers, but also hold key information about illicit trafficking, storage, etc., to awareness raising and advocacy. And I really liked your example of the awareness raising caravans that are circulating in Bamako and beyond, and working with the population on the very specific kinds of small arms that in the respective environments pose the major security threat. So I'll leave it there for now. I think my 2 minutes are over.
Thank you very much, Mia. That captured the points very well, I hope. Last but not least, we move to Hajar Sharif, the co-founder of Together We Build It organization, to take us to Libya and share with us some of her insights and reflections based on her work and observation. So, prefer to speak from here, or please? Yeah.
Well, good afternoon. I'm having an exciting evening, so that's why I'm joking. Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Exactly. It's a very exciting topic, so we should all be super focused and pretty much awake for that. Merci beaucoup. I wish if Ines was here so we can thank her in person. But just to go back to what you both mentioned, because I think, first of all, it's very important to keep in mind that we're not only talking about a technical issue in terms of the technicalities of how we do it in itself, but we also need to look at it from the broader perspective. So basically talking about peace and security. If we would go to the context of Libya, and I understand it's similar to other contexts, but it also have it's more or less special features as well. So background note, as most probably most of you know, Libya is a conflict country, a war zone. There's different terminologies that you can describe what's going on in the country right now. From 2014 until this moment, we can say this is the time where there is a formal peace-building process taking place. And before 2014, there was a peace-building process taking place, but it was more of a national dialogue. So it was led by Libya, it was led by Libyans, and it was held at different parts of the country, and etc. After 2014, the peace-building process, which is also an equivalent to a political process, has been entirely led by the international community and officially by the United Nations. Now, for me, it's very interesting every time I attend an event or a meeting, especially in an international context, and especially when it's related to gender, because for me, it seems that everyone recognized the role that women play in peace and security, including our very specific topic. And I've never come across someone who disagreed to it. But then I started wondering, well, maybe I've never asked. So it's worth actually to ask, is there anyone in the room who thinks women have no role to play in peace building? You can raise your hand. Is there anyone who believes that, well, a peace-building process can work well without women being part of it? You can raise your hand. Is there anyone who believes that there would be a political / peace agreement, a sustainable one that can work out without women being part of it? Okay, I'm slightly confused because then I don't really understand the problem. Earlier you mentioned 1325. It's almost 20 years since the Security Council officially recognized that women have a role to play in peace building, and still we don't see them. Ines earlier talked about representation. I would like to take it further. It's not only about representation, but it's about participation. If we look at the Libyan example, again, it's entirely led by the international community. It's led by the UN, it's led by different member states who are supporting the process. So any peace negotiations that are taking place at the moment, at least on the formal national level, they are not led by Libyans. And yet we don't see women being part of it, which means that, well, if it's the UN who's holding a meeting and inviting people to attend, and there are no women in these meetings, that means that the international community did not attend them and did not invite them. So I work with the Together We Build It organization. It's a local civil society based in Libya. Our headquarters office is in Tripoli, but we have different local partners all across the country. And from 2014 until this moment, our advocacy work is not only focused on a national level, you know, where we speak to our own national decision makers, but we also have to speak to the international decision makers and convince them that we as Libyan women have a role to play in the peace-building process that they are mediating or they are facilitating. Before 2014, there was, for example, a security sector reform taking place in the country. And funny enough, it might sound ironic, it might sound unbelievable, it was much easier to advocate that process than now advocating the United Nations mission to Libya to include women in the peace-building process. And when I'm talking about a security sector reform, I'm talking about us going to the Libyan government saying that, well, we need to have women in the police force, we need to have women in the national army, And I'm not going to make it sound an Ethiopia and say, well, they were welcoming and suddenly there's 1,000 women who joined, but they were not against it 100%, which means that there is a window, there is an opening, and we just need to do things the right way and not go with the stereotypes and the excuses that matters are extremely complicated, because that's pretty much the justification we always hear from the international community. Whenever they're holding a process or facilitating a process and there is no women there, and we ask, okay, why? Why didn't you invite women? Well, there's two excuses. The first one, they would say, well, the peace-building process is very sensitive. You know, we're barely convincing these men to come to the room. So if we're going to include another element on the agenda of this meeting, they're going to strike. And for me as a Libyan, I'm like, well, if they agree to come to the meeting from the first place, then they're not going to strike. And if they strike against the meeting, I don't think it's because it's women. It might be another reason. And actually, there has been meetings where these men came and then they striked, and there was no woman. So clearly, the issue is not as simple as, well, it's a very sensitive topic, we need to keep it limited, so we cannot invite women, and also young women. And then the second excuse, it's pretty much, well, at the end of the day, we're talking that we need the war to stop, right? We need the conflict in itself to stop. And pretty much the ones who are fighting each other are not women, they're men. And I also find this very interesting because usually the one invited to the room are not the ones on the ground. So it's a bit of an irrelevant excuse to me, at least mathematically, because you're still inviting representations, you're still inviting people who are not fighting each other on the ground. So why not open up the process? And then there's also a third excuse, which is, well, these meetings are political meetings. We're going to discuss hardcore politics, and in the context of Libya, when we're talking about politics, we're talking about peace and security. 90% of the major discussions when it comes to political negotiations, it's pretty much peace and security. And then they say, well, this is a political meeting. You, as women from civil society, has no role to play in it. And I'm absolutely fine with that. But there are women who are in these political institutions, and within these political institutions, there are female politicians, there are senior officials who are women, so they do have the title that qualify them to attend these processes and be part of these processes. So maybe within the discussion you can also help me understand the gaps, because at the end of the day, at least again to a context that is very specific to Libya, where the peace-building process is entirely led by the international community, by the United Nations, but also by different member states who sometimes volunteer to hold bilateral meetings or bilateral initiatives, as they are called, and yet we don't see women there. So I'm very excited to have a conversation, and if anyone knows why, please let me know, because I'm very eager to know. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Hajar, for raising all these questions. So let's see what kind of answers we will have, and puzzling remarks. But we still have some more time to listen to Mia now, as our discussant, to reflect on these issues. And you have 7 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for your interesting presentations. I feel very, very inspired in so many different ways. It's going to be hard to drag it all down to a brief discussion. What I find very interesting across the 3 presentations is that all of you have made it very clear that in order to understand arms-related and security-related problems, and to address them effectively and sustainably, we need two components. We need to tackle the gap that we see in women's participation, in women being there and taking part in the same way as men, having the same power, the same access to leadership roles, the same access to being negotiators, in order to make a change as women. On the other hand, we cannot do without a proper gender analysis. And with the gender analysis, you've all referred in different ways to holistic approaches, approaches that are inclusive, that are comprehensive, that are context sensitive. Anas Mohammed talked about sex and age disaggregated data as one gap, but also made it very clear that we need to go beyond this if we want to address the underlying drivers of our relationship and behavior towards small arms. So we're talking about gender norms, about social norms that have to be addressed in order to not only attack the symptom, let's say the choppy waters, but also to get to the undercurrents that are driving us in these directions. I found it very interesting to hear from the Malian case about women's different roles and women's active engagement, also with government in these roles that I summarized before. I won't do that again. And in your presentation, I love the way you just confront us. You just put the mirror and say, look, you're not doing it yourselves, and why am I not seeing it? And why can we all agree and it's still not there? And you pointed to something that is so interesting to me. Women as the sensitive element that has to be taken off the room in order for men to be able to make peace. War and peace as men's issue, and hardcore politics as being reserved to men. We're talking about stereotypes here. We're talking about patriarchal gender roles that are precisely these undercurrents that we have to somehow attack and transform slowly in order to get to more gender equality in small arms control and to more gender responsive small arms control policies that can be effective and sustainable. Anas Mohammed mentioned the need for guidance, and Colonel Major, you also pointed out the need for assistance on implementing these converging agendas, on benefiting from all the work that's been done in women, peace and security, in the SDGs, in the international arms control regime. And I would like to come back to the GLASS project that was so kindly introduced at the beginning of this event, because we've precisely tried to work in the dimensions of women's full and equal participation and gender analysis to develop that kind of guidance that we identified the need for. We just published last week a handbook. It's a practical guide to gender responsive small arms control, where we look into these converging agendas, where are the gaps, where are they mutually reinforcing, and where can we possibly use it better, for example, in the development of national action plans. We have a case study on South African small arms legislation where women's groups played a crucial role. We have a chapter that is precisely dedicated to small arms programming along the small arms life cycle, seeing how we can incorporate a gender perspective into each of the technical steps without losing the bigger picture out of view, and with a strong focus on gender norms. And then we have one chapter on gender responsive monitoring and evaluation in order to make all our programs more gender responsive. I dare not say it could be interesting for your UN example, but it made me think of it. And then let me just hint to the larger GLASS project's efforts to build the evidence base, because this is something that's also come up. And in Ines Mohammed's presentation, we lack a lot of evidence, and this is in part because it's difficult to collect, in part because there's a lack of guidance on how to go about the collection, in part because we could do a better job at many different levels, from government to civil society, in making the data that we produce available and understandable to each other, so that we can make better use of it. Something that came out of earlier consultations we had around the ATT State Conference in August. So we're working on that on different databases. If you're interested in our work, please visit our website. We have a table outside with the most recent publications relevant for gender and small arms control. And I would like to leave it there, but have some questions. Can also ask them later. May I open the questions floor? Thank you. So my first question would go to Colonel Major. You talked about the national action plans, and this is something that I'm very interested in, because you mentioned there's a need for making them more considerate of vulnerable groups, and more, taking more a gender perspective into account. We see in our larger analysis that this is a global problem, that national action plans and small arms take gender little into account, and the other way around for the WPS national action plan. So I would be very interested to know what the action plan in Mali looks like precisely, where you see a gender perspective could be helpful or fit into, and how the Geneva community of experts in peace building, in small arms research, in gender, could support you in this effort. I'll go with one question and let you have the others.
Would you like to address it on the spot? Yeah, would you like to address Mia's question?
Oui, mais ici, je peux parler. Non, c'est bon?
Vous pouvez parler là.
Oui, mais je vais vous répondre là. Non, c'est bon? Oui. C'est pour le plan d'action, non? Vous voulez savoir? OK. On a un plan d'action de 5 ans. Et ça, c'est jusqu'en 2023. Et compte tenu de tout ce que les femmes elles-mêmes présentent, c'est-à-dire elles sont très intéressées par le contrôle des armes, de la lutte contre la prolifération des armes légères. Au départ, elles avaient surtout des activités pour maintenir la paix. Elles parlaient entre les communautés. C'est les femmes qui parlaient. Au départ, on a dit que la paix, comme elle l'a dit, quand les hommes se battent sur le terrain, les femmes n'ont pas droit à la parole, tout. Mais les femmes se sont dit, ce sont nos enfants, c'est nos maris, c'est nous qui mettons nos enfants, nous donnons la vie aux enfants, on les voit mourir devant, on vient tout juste sur, si c'est des enfants qui sont engagés dans l'armée, on vient leur dire que son enfant est mort sur le terrain. Souvent, elle ne peut même pas voir l'enfant parce que, comme c'est l'Afrique, on ne va pas montrer un corps mutilé à sa mère. Donc ça, c'est des douleurs que les femmes ont. Vous êtes au courant que pendant ces derniers moments, il y a eu des villages brûlés avec des enfants, des femmes, tout. Mais les femmes se sont dit non, on ne va pas laisser les hommes seulement s'occuper de ces problèmes. Parce que nous mettons nos enfants, au moins pas pour donner à la mort, je peux ajouter gratuitement, parce qu'elles ne voient pas pourquoi les enfants doivent mourir pour sans cause, elles ne comprennent pas la cause. Parce que ce qu'on peut dire au Mali, nous, on n'a jamais pensé que le problème malien allait jusqu'à ce point. Et nous avons compris qu'il y a des problèmes géostratégiques. Parce que comment ça se fait? Aujourd'hui, au Mali, toutes les nations sont représentées. Au moins une personne d'une région du monde est présente au Mali. Et il y a des armées, beaucoup d'armées étrangères au Mali, mais ça n'arrête pas les morts d'hommes. C'est les gens qui meurent. Les femmes n'ont pas compris pourquoi. Quand il y a des hommes, des milliers d'hommes, 15 000 hommes armés, des forces étrangères qui sont sur le terrain et qu'il y a toujours des morts, pas seulement des militaires, mais des villages entiers qui sont brûlés, les femmes ne peuvent pas comprendre ça. Donc c'est pourquoi elles-mêmes, elles se déplacent pour aller faire entendre leur voix. Et nous, comme nous nous occupons, moi en tant que femme, je m'occupe de la lutte contre la prolifération des armes. J'ai demandé au ministère de tutelle qu'on prenne en compte la demande des femmes. Donc quand on établissait le plan d'action, on a donné une grande part aux femmes. Parce que ce qu'elles sont en train de dire, et vraiment, on ne peut pas aller au-delà de ça. Elles veulent s'impliquer, elles ne veulent pas prendre les armes, mais elles veulent lutter contre la prolifération des armes légères parce que ce sont leurs enfants, leurs maris qui sont toujours tombés et elles ont toujours des larmes aux yeux d'après ce qu'elles ont dit. Et c'est elles qui sont toujours en train de pleurer. Et personne n'entend leur douleur. Maintenant, elles vont se lever maintenant pour aller, à qui de droit, pour aller s'exprimer. Et pas seulement parler, mais elles vont faire des actions aussi. C'est ça la caravane, ça explique la caravane. Elles vont dans tous les villages pour parler aux villageois, à la communauté, à l'administration qui s'y présente pour leur dire il y a des étrangers parmi nous. Parce qu'on ne peut pas dire que les djihadistes, comme vous avez vu, Boko Haram, s'ils sont représentés de partout parce qu'il y a le couloir dans le Sahel, il y a tout un couloir de... Quand on parle d'armes, il y a la drogue. Donc, ce n'est pas seulement des Maliens, mais qui viennent de partout. Des bandits armés qui viennent... Ils utilisent cet espace pour faire passer et la drogue et les armes. Et aussi le trafic humain. Voilà. Je ne sais pas si j'ai répondu à la question, mais...
Thank you. I'm sure you have more questions, but as we have around 15 to 20 minutes, maybe we hear from you now, and we'll keep the 2 questions or so that you have. So maybe we take 2 questions. Who would like to start? Do we have a running microphone somewhere? So we'll start with the first question, the gentleman at the back. Any other question from this side?
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'm Mr. Baruti. I will address my question to Madame Major Nema Sagara. Madame, je n'ai pas de questions, mais j'ai des commentaires à faire sur votre exposé. D'abord, en tant qu'Africain, et ensuite, je suis moi-même impliqué dans le commerce sur les armes traitées, depuis presque 10 ans maintenant. La première observation, c'est que la question de l'implication des femmes dans la lutte contre les armes légères et des petits calibres n'est pas seulement la question de contrôle des armes, mais c'est aussi une question de services de renseignement. la partie formation dans pour les renseignements des femmes en Afrique est encore très, très peu développée. Et je pense que c'est le point pour lequel, dans les programmes d'action, les gouvernements de l'Afrique de l'Ouest particulièrement, mais de l'Afrique en général, doivent encourager la formation et l'incorporation des jeunes femmes dans les services de renseignement pour détecter comment les réseaux mafieux s'opèrent. Et c'est facile d'ailleurs, puisque les femmes peuvent tirer des informations par beaucoup de moyens. La deuxième question, c'est en rapport avec le Sahel, qui pour le moment bénéficie de l'appui de l'Union européenne pour une sécurité commune pour le Sahel. Mais la Mauritanie ne fait pas partie de l'UMOA. C'est une question de structure. Cela veut dire que s'il y a un problème dans un pays de l'UMOA, pour traverser, aller poursuivre les criminels en Mauritanie, ils doivent passer des formalités à la frontière, puisque la Mauritanie n'est pas partie de l'UMOA. C'est une question qui doit trouver une solution très rapidement. Merci.
Thank you very much. We have another question. Shall we take another question?
Oui, je vais lui dire. Je peux? Merci, monsieur. Quand vous parlez de renseignement, ce matin, on a discuté. Les femmes détiennent toutes les informations. Mais compte tenu de la culture, on les fait taire. Donc, depuis la petite fille, on lui a appris à se taire, même si elle a des informations. Elle est obligée de se taire parce qu'elle est une fille. Les femmes veulent sortir de là. Je ne savais pas que quelqu'un allait me parler de ça dans la salle, mais ce matin, on en parlait. J'ai dit que c'est les femmes qui ont les informations sur les armes. Elles n'utilisent pas les armes, mais elles ont des informations sur toutes les armes. Elles donnent des informations sur des gens. Elles ont, c'est-à-dire elles connaissent. Mais le fait culturellement de peser sur elles, ce phénomène de se taire, parce qu'une femme doit se taire, donc ça fait que les informations restent inutiles, même si elles ont ça. Voilà. Donc pour le reste, merci beaucoup.
Thank you. We have another question, please.
Hi, thank you. My name is Lorraine. I'm at DCAF, just the organization next door. Both a couple of questions and comments. First of all, thank you both for all three, and Mia also for your presentations. It's interesting because what I heard, ce que j'entendais des deux présentations, c'est que en fait, bon, pour la question du genre, moi j'ai entendu très clairement que en fait la communauté internationale, on ne fait pas assez notre effort d'assurer à ce que tout le monde comprenne bien cette question et comment l'intégrer dans le travail qu'ils font à l'étranger ou dans vos pays, ou en Libye en particulier. Et je dirais même aussi au Mali. Comme vous avez bien dit, il y a tous les pays qui sont représentés là, il y a toutes les missions. Et je sais que la coordination ne fonctionne pas assez bien entre les partenaires internationaux. Mais je suis très contente d'entendre qu'il y a cette initiative de caravane. Alors, colonel-major, je voulais savoir qui sont les femmes qui participent dans les caravanes. Est-ce que la hiérarchie et le gouvernement est ouvert à les entendre aussi? Est-ce qu'il y aura un suivi? Est-ce que c'est juste dans la région de Bamako ou est-ce que c'est ailleurs aussi? And then for you, I mean, I completely understand your concern, and actually, I mean, I think it's a good reminder for all of us that, you know, gender must be taken into account, and it's not something that our partners on the ground need to take into account. We ourselves need to take into account in how we act and how we behave and how we program and how we make policy. And I think, you know, even if you look at some of the women, peace, and security frameworks or national action plans that some countries have, it's very interesting that in the West, a lot of our action plans are outward-looking, not enough inward-looking, just because of our development policies, et cetera, et cetera. So thanks again for bringing your perspectives here, and it's a good reminder to all of us, I think.
Thank you. Any more questions, or would you like to address the remarks? I might have a quick question based on, for the Libyan context, based on our research. We've been conducting some research on community-based initiatives to control small arms in Libya, and we studied around 12 case studies in Libya. And what came across all these case studies, and very strongly, is that the role of women and youth is fundamental to have effective initiatives to control small arms at the community level. And the question, or the observation, or the question is, do you think in the Libyan context, if at the macro level we have less fragmentation, then the role for men and for women and youth in particular will be more recognized? Or in the case of having fragmentation, then the marginalized will get even further marginalized as like fragmented of the fragmentations. Then this is why the role of women and youth is not recognized. So if we imagine the future and if we imagine a unified leadership at the top level, at the macro level, would that change anything in the equation?
I feel like you can play a game with me where you give me any scenario and ask me what's the role the international community plays in that, and I'll be able to answer it. It's super. I find your question really interesting, and when you first said macro, I'm wondering if you mean Libyan macro or global macro level. Well, I think before getting into the Libyan macro level, it's important to talk about the global macro level. And it's also interesting in the context of the topic we're discussing, because, for an example, there is a UN Security Council resolution on arms embargo, and it's being breached. It's being breached not only on the Libyan level. I'm not even quite sure if it's called breach on the Libyan level, but it's being breached on the international level. And this is not me just speaking based on speculations. There is even a conference that's going to take place supposedly this month in Germany, and this is one of the topics that will be discussed. The role of the international community in upholding its own commitment and its own resolution that was adopted from the Security Council. Now, from the local level perspective, and this is something that is shared not only by civil society activists who are working in this field, but also by really ordinary people, is that if there is no real political will on the global macro level, then it's really unfortunate to say sometimes it doesn't really matter what we do on ground, because you can work for 10 years on local initiatives, on arms control. You can train local actors. These local actors can do initiatives all over the country, and it's possible, it's being done not only in the big cities, but really in rural places. But then at the end of the day, if there is still a window for these arms to get into the country, then it really doesn't matter what we're doing on ground. And when it comes to Libya, it's very, very important. It's very important to keep in mind that the solution is not only a Libyan solution. If we're talking about peace and security, we're not only talking about Libyans agreeing together. That's a very simplified and, in my opinion, romanticized approach. Because at the end of the day, the armed groups who are fighting each other, they are supported by different countries. And then, more or less, if it's not really only about them agreeing, it feels that the whole world needs to agree on what happens in Libya, and then maybe the Libyans can come together and agree. And for me, this is a very, it's a close topic to my heart, because seeing what's happening on the ground right now, we're not a country that produce any sort of weapons, yet armed groups have access to weapons, not only small arms, but different sorts of military equipment. Civilians are the ones who are being affected by that, and And yet, it's not only a Libyan solution. Before 2011, I actually started studying medicine inspired by Grey's Anatomy. And then I switched to law inspired by Suits. So that says quite a lot. When I did some parts of my training for medicine school, really like the most exciting case, this would be like the topic of the month if we had a case in the emergency room where someone was stabbed by a knife. That was a big deal. Now it's very normal for the hospital to be filled by people shot, people injured from airstrikes, people injured from all sort of kinds of weapons. And when I hear the international community focusing only on Libyans need to come together and agree and stop fighting each other, I just think like, you know what, stop the arms flow and let them fight each other by sword. Let them go to the desert and fight each other, and whoever wins comes back to us. But if they keep having access to arms, not only small arms, but if they keep having access by the international community with weapons, then they're not really the ones affected, because right now in Tripoli we have groups fighting each other from different cities, and yet the only ones who are being affected are the civilians. So when it comes to this particular matter, it's not only Libya is the micro level and the international community is the macro level in terms of fragmentation. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Colonel, would you like to comment on the comment?
Non, bon, elle avait une question.
Les femmes, elles viennent d'où? Est-ce que c'est juste de Bamako? C'est de quelle région?
Bon, c'est toutes les femmes, hein, parce que c'est toutes les femmes qui souffrent. Et les femmes du Nord, les femmes du Sud. C'est les femmes de la société civile, oui. Comme moyen, comme je vous dis, c'est la volonté des femmes, mais elle manque beaucoup de moyens, parce que pour le gouvernement, ils ne vont pas dire théoriquement, mais dans la pratique, on met un peu les femmes de côté. Et c'est que les femmes actuellement refusent, comme j'ai dit, parce que c'est elles qui souffrent plus que tout le monde pour avoir perdu son enfant, son mari, tout ça. Donc, effectivement, la communauté internationale, lui, eux, ils nous aident, ils nous donnent des moyens. Je les remercie, mais pour le moment, ce n'est pas encore suffisant, parce qu'il y a beaucoup à faire au Mali. Nous ne comprenons pas pourquoi, comme elle a dit, nous n'avons pas d'usine de fabrication d'armes. Mais les armes qui sont au Mali aujourd'hui, ce n'est pas pour exagérer. Je ne sais pas si dans le monde entier, il en existe. Pourquoi? Et ça tue les gens en longueur de journée. Il n'y a pas une semaine, on a perdu 54 jeunes sur le terrain. On est venu tirer sur eux. Et la façon dont on vient les attaquer, moi, je me demande quel groupe des djihadistes qui ne sont pas ensemble sont organisés de la façon pour venir attaquer tout un camp. Donc, c'est vraiment un problème. Et les femmes se soucient beaucoup de ça. Et elles ne s'asseyent pas. Maintenant, elles veulent pas prendre les armes, mais se battre sans les armes et gagner cette guerre. Et ça, c'est possible aussi. Oui.
We have 4 more minutes, so anyone would like to answer, ask a question. This is,
Answer also.
or also answer. This is your chance, please. And then we'll have final question from Mia. You get one.
Hi, my name is Maggie. I'm from Canada, so I can speak French if you prefer, because my question will be for you. So, je me demandais en fait, quel est le rôle des femmes dans... Oui, pour vous, exactement. Quel est le rôle des femmes dans les opérations de contre-terrorisme au Mali? Puis, est-ce que le contre-terrorisme a eu des impacts sur la vie des femmes de tous les jours? Est-ce que ça a eu des impacts négatifs ou positifs sur la vie des femmes maliennes? Merci.
And we have the final question.
I think one closing question for both of you and Anas, who unfortunately can't reply from my side, would be we have seen that tackling gender stereotypes and advocating for women's inclusion are two components that come up in a synthesizing manner, if I may. And I would like to draw on your experience to see if you could give us any good practices, any from your own working experience that we can take and see if it works for other contexts, if we can learn something for the bigger picture from your concrete experiences. Thank you.
Well, I think first of all is just implement what is there. When it comes, for example, for the Security Council Resolution 1325, there is an existing framework. We don't need to reinvent something new. In terms of the really basic framework, it is there. It tackles pretty much different aspects when it comes to peace and security, even when it comes to the hardcore security processes that we're talking about. I think it's more of a request from a local NGO, is that it doesn't really matter how much we do on ground and how much we advocate on a national level. It really matters a lot what's happening on an international level. And sometimes it's not possible for us to reach out to international actors, even when it comes to processes that are happening about our own country. Most of the peace-building processes in terms of meetings and events are taking place outside of Libya. It's inaccessible. And that's why we also need the support of the international community, not only member states and countries, but also international community in terms of civil society. Because if we're not able to access a meeting, if we're not able to advocate towards international key stakeholders, then we would want you to do that on our behalf. Yeah.
Can you please repeat the question? The role of women in counterterrorism and the impact of counterterrorism on women in Mali.
Le rôle des femmes. Hein?
Oui, dans le counterterrorisme.
Oui.
Et l'impact du counterterrorisme sur les femmes maliennes.
Donc l'impact, hein, pardon?
Je sais que c'est pas directement sur le sujet de la conférence, mais...
Je peux toujours répondre, je suis là. Ouais. C'est nous qui subissons plutôt le problème et la prolifération des armes et puis le terrorisme et tout. Et, ok, l'impact sur les femmes, je commence d'abord par la douleur. Parce que même si les femmes ne sont pas sur le terrain, surtout, je veux dire, au Mali, la ligne de front, c'est partout. Ça peut être même dans la cuisine. Parce que les terroristes vont partout. On peut parler des djihadistes parce qu'il y a question de religion dedans et puis tout est mélangé. Et comme j'ai dit, c'est les femmes qui souffrent beaucoup. Je ne sais pas si vous êtes mère... Voilà, vous serez mère. Imaginez que vous êtes mère, si vous n'êtes pas mère. Et imaginez qu'on vous enlève votre enfant, qu'on tue votre enfant violemment. Et l'impact, je n'ai pas besoin de vous dire. L'impact, c'est ce que ça porte sur la personne. La séparation de l'être cher, vous pouvez comprendre quel impact ça peut faire. Et comme je dis, les femmes ne comprennent pas pourquoi au Mali, nous sommes exposés à ces djihadistes. On vient tuer les gens gratuitement. Je dis gratuitement parce qu'il n'y a aucune raison qu'on nous explique si ce n'est pas la religion. Et, parce que, comme on peut dire, dans toutes les communautés, dans le monde entier, il y a des querelles. Et chez nous, il y avait ça. Il y avait des querelles entre cultivateurs, entre éleveurs, entre pêcheurs. Mais ça n'allait pas au-delà des bâtons. Souvent, c'était des paroles, on s'est lancé des paroles, et puis il y a toujours des négociations, et ça passe. Mais aujourd'hui, c'est les armes qui sont venues compliquées, et c'est des armes qui viennent de partout. Donc les femmes veulent lutter contre la présence de ces armes sur le terrain. Vous pouvez bien être... en 2012, par exemple, je vais vous dire, les hommes sont partis de... Ça, c'était une région du Mali. Les djihadistes étaient... Parce que quand les groupes armés sont venus, il y avait 3 régions, 3 différents groupes qui avaient 3 différents objectifs. Il y avait ceux qui sont venus pour la religion, ceux qui sont venus parce qu'ils veulent être indépendants, tout ça. Donc, c'était compliqué. Mais c'est les femmes qui ont tenu, sans les armes, à lutter contre ces djihadistes. Les hommes sont partis. Ce n'est pas pour dire que les hommes sont lâches ou pas, mais ils sont partis. Les femmes sont restées avec leurs enfants. Et elles ont tenu. Elles ont quand même affaibli ces djihadistes-là. Parce qu'elles étaient même interdites de se baisser dans le marché. Et chez nous, comme vous savez, les marchandises sont par terre. Vous êtes obligés de vous baisser pour ramasser ce que vous avez acheté. Parce que c'est des tas de marchandises. Finalement, les djihadistes interdisaient aux dames de se baisser. Mais quelle était leur arme? Elles ont choisi de se baisser pour prendre leurs marchandises. Parce que c'était interdit. Et elles ont dit, les interdits, tous ceux qui vont interdire ces djihadistes, elles vont donner, sacrifier leurs armes. Pourtant, elles n'avaient pas d'armes. C'est pourquoi j'ai dit, elles peuvent faire la guerre les mains nues. Quand une femme est décidée, elle peut faire ce qu'elle décide de faire. Donc maintenant, les femmes au Mali sont décidées d'aller à l'encontre de ces gens, même armés. Compte tenu de l'impact que vous avez dit, compte tenu de la douleur qu'elle ressentent aujourd'hui, c'est elles qui ressentent la douleur. Les hommes peuvent bien mourir. Quand quelqu'un meurt, c'est parti, c'est fini. Mais ceux qui restent derrière vous, c'est eux qui souffrent beaucoup. Donc c'est la souffrance qui les pousse à aller vers ça. Et je demande à tout le monde, surtout les internationaux, d'assister les femmes pour mener à bien leur caravane. Parce que ça demande des déplacements. Ça demande d'aller voir leurs sœurs qui sont restées sur place pour les aider, les porter, les encourager pour lutter contre ces fléaux. Les hommes, je ne vais pas dire aux hommes que vous pensez que vous êtes forts, mais en réalité, les femmes sont plus fortes que vous et c'est elles qui peuvent résoudre ce problème. Donc, acceptez de rester un peu derrière cette fois-ci pour voir ce que les femmes peuvent faire, ce qu'elles sont capables de faire. Oubliez un peu cette domination masculine et laissez les femmes faire. Vous allez voir qu'on pourra faire et on va vous mettre à l'aise. Voilà. Nous allons faire la paix pour vous.
Well, on that note, unfortunately, we reached the end. We ran out of time, but the conversation can be continued, as we mentioned earlier, through the Geneva Peace Week application. So if you have more questions or if you would like to engage in further discussion, that is one avenue for that. And I think the main takeaway is that inclusivity is the key word that we can take from here. We all matter, and for any system to be effective or any structure to be effective, we all need to have space, not only to be represented, but also to actively and constructively participate. And thank you again for being here with us and for all the questions. Thank you for the governments of the Netherlands and Canada for your continuous investment in our work at the Small Arms Survey. And thank you very much for the speakers for being with us today. And we hope you will enjoy the remaining events of the Geneva Peace Week, including the opening ceremony that will take place around 5 p.m. today. Thank you very much. Thank you.